You could have normal cholesterol, feel perfectly healthy, and still be quietly developing the conditions that trigger a heart attack. What if one of the most dangerous assumptions you can make about your health is believing that you're healthy? That question has been stuck in my mind for a long time, because every so often, you hear a story that doesn't seem to make sense. Someone exercises almost every day, they try to eat well, they maintain a healthy weight. They go to their annual checkups. Their doctor tells them their labs look good. Their cholesterol isn't alarming. Their blood pressure seems fine. Then, without any obvious warning, they suffer a heart attack. And every time I hear a story like that, I find myself asking the same question: how is that possible? As someone who has always been fascinated by biology, I've learned that some of the most important things happening inside the human body are often the things we can't feel, can't see, and sometimes aren't even looking for. The body is incredibly good at hiding problems. In fact, one of its greatest strengths, and sometimes one of its greatest dangers, is its ability to compensate. That's what makes heart disease so unsettling to me. Unlike an injury that demands your attention immediately, cardiovascular disease can spend years, even decades, developing in silence. No pain, no obvious symptoms, no dramatic warning signs. Just a slow biological process unfolding beneath the surface while life goes on as normal. What fascinates me most is that many people who eventually experience a heart attack didn't necessarily ignore their health. Some were doing many of the things we've been taught to do, yet somehow, the disease was still progressing. The deeper I started looking into science, the more I realized there was a gap between what most of us think predicts heart disease and what biology is actually doing behind the scenes. And that gap may explain why so many seemingly healthy people are caught completely off guard. What if normal cholesterol isn't always enough? What if a standard checkup can miss important clues? What if some of the biggest drivers of cardiovascular risk are things that rarely become part of everyday conversations about health? The answers led me down a path that completely changed how I think about heart disease, prevention, and the hidden processes quietly shaping our future long before symptoms ever appear. The deeper I looked for answers, the more I realized that cholesterol wasn't the only story being written inside our arteries. One of the most surprising ideas I encountered was that a person can have reasonably controlled cholesterol and still carry a significant risk of cardiovascular disease. At first, I struggled with that concept because it seemed to challenge one of the most familiar narratives in modern medicine. We hear so much about cholesterol that it's easy to assume lowering LDL is the entire game. But biology rarely revolves around a single variable. What kept appearing in study after study was the role of inflammation. I don't mean the kind of inflammation we notice after an injury. I'm talking about a quieter, more persistent process that can continue for years beneath the surface. The more I learned about it, the more I began to see inflammation as a kind of biological amplifier. It doesn't necessarily start the problem, but it can make existing problems far more dangerous. One study that particularly captured my attention was the CANTOS trial. Researchers looked at more than 10,000 people with established cardiovascular disease, whose LDL levels were already fairly well controlled. Instead of focusing on cholesterol, they asked a different question: what happens if inflammation is reduced? What fascinated me wasn't just the results, but what those results implied. People who achieved lower levels of inflammation experienced fewer major cardiovascular events, despite no meaningful change in cholesterol levels. To me, that finding revealed something profound about how complex the human body really is. Two people may have similar cholesterol numbers, yet their risk profiles can look very different depending on what else is happening biologically. This is why I find markers like high-sensitivity C-reactive protein, or hsCRP, so interesting. They offer a glimpse into processes that traditional cholesterol tests cannot fully capture. What makes inflammation even more intriguing is that it often reflects something deeper. Excess visceral fat, poor sleep, chronic stress, insulin resistance, and even untreated dental issues can all contribute to it. In other words, inflammation is often less of a disease itself and more of a signal, a message from the body that something in the system deserves closer attention. Once I started viewing inflammation as a clue rather than the entire explanation, I found myself asking a different question. Are we even measuring cholesterol risk in the most meaningful way? For years, LDL cholesterol has been the number most people focus on, and understandably so. It has become almost synonymous with heart disease risk, but the more I explored the biology of how plaque actually forms, the more I realized that LDL is only one piece of a much larger picture. What fascinated me was the idea that cholesterol itself isn't the real traveler moving through our bloodstream. It rides inside particles called lipoproteins. LDL is one of them, but it's not alone. There are other particles, including VLDL and IDL, that can also contribute to plaque formation, and that's where a marker called ApoB began to make a lot more sense to me. ApoB isn't simply measuring how much cholesterol is present, it's helping estimate the number of potentially atherogenic particles circulating through the bloodstream. In a way, it shifts the question from how much cargo is being transported to how many vehicles are on the road. And biologically, that distinction matters. What makes this particularly important is that LDL and ApoB don't always tell the same story. This is especially true in people with insulin resistance, fatty liver disease, prediabetes, type 2 diabetes, or other metabolic conditions. Someone can have an LDL level that appears acceptable while still carrying a higher number of particles capable of entering artery walls and contributing to plaque over time. But perhaps the biggest shift in my thinking wasn't about ApoB itself, it was about time. Most cardiovascular discussions revolve around the next 10 years. What's your 10-year risk? Should you worry right now? Yet plaque doesn't operate on a 10-year schedule. It's often the result of countless biological interactions accumulating over decades. When I think about heart disease today, I don't think of it as a sudden event. I think of it as a long story unfolding quietly in the background. That perspective makes markers like ApoB feel less like numbers on a lab report and more like clues about where that story may be heading 30 or 40 years from now, and that long-term view changes everything. And just when I thought I was beginning to understand the story, I came across two factors that made the picture even more complex, and, in some ways, even more fascinating. The first was lipoprotein A, often called Lp(a). What immediately caught my attention wasn't just what it does, but how little most people know about it. Here is a risk factor that doesn't appear on a standard cholesterol panel, can significantly increase cardiovascular risk, and yet many people have never had it measured. What makes Lp(a) so intriguing is that it is largely determined by genetics. Unlike many health markers that respond to lifestyle changes, this is one of those biological cards you're dealt at birth. It's structurally similar to LDL, but it carries an additional protein that appears to make it more likely to contribute to plaque formation and clot-related events. The more I read about it, the more I understood why elevated Lp(a) is often discussed when otherwise healthy individuals experience heart attacks or strokes earlier than expected. There's something humbling about that realization. We like to believe that health is entirely under our control, but biology occasionally reminds us that genetics still matter. At the same time, I became increasingly interested in a factor that sits at the opposite end of the spectrum, one that is often heavily influenced by lifestyle and modern habits. That factor is insulin resistance. The reason insulin resistance fascinates me is because it seems to connect so many different conditions that people often think of as separate problems. Fatty liver disease, high blood pressure, elevated triglycerides, prediabetes, type 2 diabetes, and even certain hormonal disorders frequently trace back to the same underlying metabolic dysfunction. What makes it particularly deceptive is that it can remain hidden for years, blood sugar may still look normal. A person may feel perfectly fine, yet behind the scenes, the body may be producing increasingly higher amounts of insulin just to maintain that appearance of normality. The more I learned about insulin resistance, the more it felt like discovering a hidden control center influencing multiple aspects of cardiovascular health at once. It wasn't simply another risk factor, it was a mechanism capable of quietly shaping inflammation, lipid metabolism, and long-term disease risk all at the same time. The more pieces of the puzzle I uncovered, the more I realized there was still one question none of these blood markers could fully answer. Has plaque already started to build? This is where my curiosity about cardiovascular health took another turn, because while markers like inflammation, ApoB, Lp(a), and insulin resistance can tell us a great deal about risk, they are still, in many ways, indirect signals. They're clues, they're indicators, they're probabilities. But they don't actually let us see what's happening inside the arteries themselves. And that's what makes imaging so compelling. There's something powerful about moving from prediction to observation. Instead of asking what might happen in the future, imaging allows us to ask a different question. What is happening right now? Tests such as coronary artery calcium scoring, coronary CT angiography, and carotid intima media thickness ultrasound each offer a different window into the progression of cardiovascular disease. They don't replace blood markers, but they add another layer of understanding. They help bridge the gap between biological risk and physical evidence. What I find particularly fascinating is how this reflects a broader shift in modern medicine. For much of history, medicine has largely been reactive. Symptoms appeared, disease was discovered, and treatment followed. But many of the most significant diseases of aging don't emerge overnight. They develop gradually, often leaving subtle traces long before they become life-threatening. Heart disease may be one of the clearest examples of this reality. The more I study biology, the more I appreciate that the human body rarely keeps secrets forever. It usually leaves clues along the way. The challenge is that those clues often appear years before most people are looking for them. And perhaps that's the biggest lesson I've taken from this entire journey. Heart attacks often seem sudden, but the biological processes behind them are usually anything but sudden. They are stories that unfold over decades, shaped by genetics, metabolism, inflammation, and lifestyle. What gives me optimism is knowing that awareness changes the story. The earlier we understand the signals our bodies are sending, the more opportunities we have to act before disease becomes destiny. And in many ways, that's what prevention is really about, not predicting the future perfectly, but recognizing the clues early enough to help create a different one. If there's one lesson I've taken away from exploring this science, it's that health is often shaped by the things we don't notice, not just the things we do. The body rarely moves from healthy to diseased overnight. More often, it sends subtle signals for years before major problems appear. That's why being proactive matters. Pay attention to your long-term health, ask thoughtful questions, understand your risk factors, and focus on habits that support your body for decades, not just today. Small decisions, repeated consistently, can profoundly influence the future version of yourself. I'm curious, what was the most surprising thing you learned from this video? Let me know in the comments below so everyone can learn from different perspectives and experiences. And if you enjoyed this deep dive into biology, prevention, and long-term health, please consider subscribing to the channel. Your support helps motivate us to keep creating more evidence-based content and exploring fascinating topics together in future videos.